Hey everyone, I'm Alan Thrall here at Untamed Strength Gym in Sacramento, California. In this video, I'm going to be talking about failure. What is failure? Failure is what you are in life. Sorry, someone had to say it. Failure is when you are unable to perform another repetition inside of a set. We are usually talking about muscular failure, and by definition, muscular failure is when the neuromuscular system can no longer produce adequate force for a muscle to contract concentrically. So let's look at some real world examples of this. If I'm performing bench press and I get 10 reps, 7, 8, 9, 10. I lock out that 10th rep. It was a grinder. That was 10 reps at RPE 10, 0 reps in reserve. There's no way I could have got an 11th rep. I went to failure, right? Wrong. I didn't actually fail any reps during that set. They were 10 successful reps. So I can't really say that I went to failure or I took that set to failure. I got pretty close to it. I got to the doorstep and I knocked on the door of failure, but I didn't actually go inside. I would have had to fail that 11th rep in order to say that I took that set to failure. So let's say that I did do that 11th rep and I pressed up and I got a little over halfway, stall, and it came back down on my chest and pinned me down here. Could I then say that I took that set to failure? Maybe, maybe not. By definition, if we go back to that definition, the neuromuscular system can no longer produce adequate force for a muscle to contract concentrically. So even though I failed that 11th rep, I still got some juice in me. I could go for that 12th rep and get it halfway, stall and come back down. I could go for a 13th rep and get it a quarter of the way and back down. A 14th rep, get it an inch off my chest and back down. And then on the 15th rep, I've got nothing. The bar won't even flex. I can't even move it at all. So technically, by definition, that would be taking the set to failure. So this is why the argument of whether you should train to failure or just talking about training to failure can get kind of blurry, because there can be multiple definitions of failure. So let's use another example here. The standing dumbbell overhead press. Most people perform this movement to train their shoulders. So if you were to do this to failure, chances are the instability of the dumbbells is going to limit your ability to take your shoulders to muscular failure. Or maybe your core stability is going to be the limiting factor. You start wobbling around too much. So you are unable to really take your shoulders to failure because there are other things that are going to limit that. This is why some people, when they do shoulder press, will use a belt. They'll sit down on the bench. They'll use a back support to lean up against. Or they'll just use a machine if they're trying to actually take their shoulder muscles to muscular failure. So a machine could be a better option. You're not limited by other variables like instability of dumbbells or the instability of your core. And another thing that should be mentioned is that when you start training to failure, not training to be a failure, shout out to Rascal Apparel. When you start training to failure, this is something that I've been learning over the past 5 to 6 months of doing bodybuilding training. Going to failure is very uncomfortable. It takes a lot of effort. So even though you do a set of bicep curls and it hurts like hell and your arms are throbbing and you just want to let go, it's just too uncomfortable, the burn is too intense, and so you rack the weight. You went to mental failure, but not necessarily muscular failure. And that's okay. It's still productive. It's not a waste of time, but it's just something to keep in mind when you're talking about training to failure or when you think you're actually going to failure. So how do we navigate this? Why am I even making this whole video? Now, I foresee some people asking whether or not they need to train to failure. Do I even need to train to failure? Shouldn't I just do all my working sets at RP 7 or 8, like RIR 2 or 3 reps in reserve? And I would say, should you train to failure? Yes and no. For more info, I think that you need to go watch 2 videos on Basement Bodybuilding's YouTube channel. The first one is high reps are better, my opinion, and the fitness industry doesn't understand training volume. These videos aren't specifically about failure, but they are about hypertrophy rep ranges, training volume, and intensity, which sort of encapsulates this topic of failure. So personally, I have been training to failure on some movements lately, and I've been noticing good results. So maybe you, if you're not, should consider doing some of your working sets to failure. So the way that I think of failure in my training is what I mentioned at the start of this video. failure occurs when you can no longer perform a repetition inside of a set. So let's use bench press, for example. I have a clear, defined criteria for what my bench press is. Elbows locked out, barbell touches my chest. Elbows locked out, barbell touches my chest. So those are the reps that I count. I don't count partial reps. I don't count reps that have been assisted by a spotter, just full point A, point B, point A. And I'll note that in the past 5 to 6 months of doing this bodybuilding program, I have not failed, I've not physically failed one rep on bench press. So, but I will say that all of my sets are at RPE 9 or 10. Now, why am I not failing the bench press? There's 2 reasons. The first one is I don't want to actually fail and do the roll of shame. I do have safeties here at the gym, so I could just set the bar, let the bar come down on the pins, but then I'd have to wiggle out from under it and pick the bar up and put it back in the rack. I don't want to do that, and I don't train with a spotter, so I don't go to actual failure on the bench press. I have a good understanding of what RPE 10 feels like. So I have the luxury of just calling it at RPE 10 because I'm confident it was actually an RPE 10. If you're new to lifting, you might not have that experience to know what an RPE 10 feels like. Here's an actual example of this. Earlier this week, I was working with a guy, kind of a form check session. He was doing bench press, and I had asked him what his working weights are, what he normally lifts. He said, last week I did 125 pounds on bench press for 5 reps at RP 8. So he could have got 2 more reps, not 3 more. So that would be his 7 rep max. While we were warming up, he did 115 pounds for 5 reps, and it moved like air. It was effortless. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no way this guy's 125 for 5 reps at RP 8. That's way too easy. So we loaded up 125, and he thought he was gonna do 5 reps. But right before he went, I said, I want you to take this, do as many reps as you can, go past 5. Just do as many reps as you can, I'm right here to spot you. Do as many reps as you can until you can't do another rep. And he ended up doing 13 reps. Probably could have done 14, maybe even 15, but he stopped at 13. So he was under the impression that 5 reps at RP8 was his 125, and he went and did 13 reps with probably a rep or 2 left. So anyways, if you're new, you could benefit from going to failure just to kind of test your limits and your boundaries within reason. Don't be reckless in the gym. Now, the second reason that I mentioned for why I haven't failed bench press is just a safety reason, a safety element. When I do go to failure on bench press, I tend to squirm around a little bit. I start chicken winging and flapping my elbows. And so for that reason, for just being smart in the gym, live to lift another day, I don't need to push that far to failure. And this is the same for squats, bench press, deadlifts, standing overhead press, these bigger compound movements. I try to make the first rep and the last rep look the exact same. Now obviously bar speed is going to slow down as I fatigue, but the tempo of the reps, the technique should be the exact same throughout. I can push failure farther away. I can get more reps if I was to do things like start speeding up the eccentric or bouncing the bar off my chest or dive bombing my squats and really just relying on that bounce to get up. That would be making my reps look different as I went along, but I don't want to do this. I want to avoid doing this. For smaller compound movements or isolation movements, like let's say dumbbell side raises, I take those to muscular failure. I can push those a lot farther. 1, because it's just safer, but 2, I don't have a clear defined criteria for what a successful rep is. So I could say, all right, dumbbell side raises today, it'll start at my side and I'll go up to 90 degrees from my body. That's a good rep. So I'll do that as far as I can. Let's say I get to 8 reps, and then on the 9th rep I can only get it to like 80 degrees from my body. Am I gonna stop there? No, of course, I'm gonna keep going. So I'm gonna keep going. The dumbbell might get a little bit closer to my side each time, so I'm unable to bring it as high. But that's okay. I'm trying to actually hit muscular failure on my shoulder. The reps can be fudged a little more, is basically what I'm trying to say. So another example would be, this is not an isolation movement, but a smaller compound movement, pull-ups. You might look in my logbook and see that I did 3 sets of repetitions, 3 sets of max rep sets of pull-ups. I did 3 sets of pull-ups, all at max reps. Now, I usually have a target. I do have a target rep range, but let's just say, for sake of this video, bodyweight pull-ups, 3 sets, max reps. you might see that I did 12, 12, 12 and think, there's no way that you went to 12 reps to true failure and then repeated that again and again a third time, unless you took like an hour of rest between sets. But what it actually looks like is my first set might have been clean chest to bar pull-ups, total control, just banging out pull-ups like the calisthenic bros. And then the second set, maybe I did 9 reps like that. And then the last 3, it was just getting my chin over the bar. I wasn't pulling as high. And the last set, maybe I got to like 6 or 7 good clean reps. And then I was starting to kip and kind of pull my abs at the top to get my chin over. So the technique starts to degrade just slightly, and that's okay. I'm not gonna make small details like that in my notebook. I'm just gonna put 12, 12, 12. That's what I did as volume. Now, if you pay attention to this basically muscular failure is the focus for the smaller isolation movements, or some of the small compound movements, the safer movements that I can push to muscular failure. But repetition failure is the focus for bigger compound movements. Technical failure, when I can no longer perform another rep with the same technique. This isn't always the case, but most of the time it is. Now, I think the most important part of the video is this point here. The approach that I took when Natural Hypertrophy wrote me this bodybuilding program, which I will make another video about soon. I've kind of briefly talked about it, but I want to talk about it a bit more in depth. But the approach that I took when he sent me this program was perfect technique. Perfect technique for everything. I want to go to technical failure. I have this established criteria for what my technique should look like. Once I can no longer do that, I'll stop there. I have to earn the right to perform forced reps or cheat reps or doing a long rest pause, which I've done a couple of times, but I don't do very often. Now, I'm no beginner to lifting weights, but I am a beginner to formal bodybuilding training, so I'm gonna act like one. I'm gonna use perfect technique because I can get a lot of stimulus. I can reap a lot of benefits from just doing perfect technique. I don't need advanced techniques like what I mentioned, forced reps, cheat reps, swinging, and things like this. I have to master solid technique, and I need to increase the mental toughness that's required to get to failure before I can allow any sort of deviation in technique. And if I do allow myself to get sloppy with reps, or I allow myself to do cheat reps, this is gonna be an out, basically. If I tell myself, all right, I'm gonna do this set of curls to technical failure, then I'm gonna start using some cheat reps. I'm gonna call my technical failure early, just so I can start using sloppier technique. GVS actually mentioned this in one of his recent videos about guys who do drop sets, where you do a set to failure, drop the weight, a set to failure, drop the weight, set to failure, all within one big, huge set. They almost never go to actual failure because you know you have 4 or 5 more huge sets after that. So you prematurely call it and you say, okay, that was failure. You might artificially just pretend like the bar speed slowed down. So you leave some in the tank. And I know that that's what would happen to me if I allowed myself an opportunity to have an out and do these cheat reps. And when people talk about HIIT training, or HIIT, high intensity training, not high intensity training, ATM machine. When people talk about HIIT, high intensity training, you just need 1 set to failure, brother. I think that if I was to say that, if I was gonna say I'm just gonna do 1 set to failure, I realize that most of my exercises are not to actual true failure, even if I try to get to failure, because it just hurts too bad, or I'm not mentally tough enough to get to failure, or something else reaches failure. I like to do ring push-ups on one of my upper body days, and I'll do them weighted with a vest. My arms start wobbling at the very end, and my core is probably what's limiting me, not necessarily the muscles that I'm trying to target. These supporting muscles are limiting me from taking the intended muscles to failure. And so, since I'm not taking my sets to true failure, for the reasons I just mentioned, I am still doing hard sets and I'm still doing hard reps. So I might have to do a couple more of those sets because I'm not actually getting to failure. This is probably why most people do a few sets of an exercise, because they're not taking it to actual muscular failure, even if they think they are. I actually equate this to advanced powerlifters versus advanced bodybuilders. So an advanced powerlifter can truly display their 1 rep max squat because they have practice and experience. They have confidence required to get under heavyweight and do it. They have the balance and coordination. They have the muscular strength, the neuromuscular efficiency, to display their 1 rep maximum strength on the squat. However, a noob, a beginner, does not have the confidence, does not have the experience, does not have the neuromuscular efficiency, the balanced coordination required to actually display their strength. So if you've ever worked with if you've ever seen a newbie max out, they might do, one ugly rep that moves pretty quickly. There's really like no stall on the bar, but then you add 5 pounds and it totally pins them, right? So this is sort of how I think about new bodybuilders like myself and more advanced bodybuilders. They are able to get much closer to failure because they have experience and practice doing it, whereas new bodybuilders might not. So I'm going to stick to good technique because I'm getting good results from it. Once I start stalling, then maybe I'll use some more advanced techniques. That's it. Thanks for watching, and always remember, tread on time.